A 6-year-old beggar girl enters a luxury tailor shop, takes a suit from the hanger and approaches the counter with a crumpled $5 bill. With a child's innocence, she says determinedly to the millionaire store owner, "Sir, I want to buy a suit." He laughs, explaining that $5 wouldn't even buy a tie, but his curiosity is awakened when he asks what she needs the suit for. The girl's answer was like a punch to the millionaire's stomach, leaving him devastated and unable to contain his tears. The afternoon sun streamed through the display windows of Sterling & Co., fine tailoring like golden blades, illuminating rows of suits that cost more than many people earned in a year. Edward Montgomery adjusted the cuffs of his Italian silk shirt as he examined a black silk tuxedo, his fingers gliding over the fabric's impeccable texture. At 52, he had built a real estate empire that placed him among the city's wealthiest men. Yet his true passion had always been the refined elegance that only well-applied money could buy. The tailor shop was his private sanctuary, a place where every garment hanging represented not just status, but also the meticulous control he exercised over every aspect of his life. Edward observed his reflection in the Venetian mirror: perfectly aligned grey hair, a precisely trimmed beard, an erect posture that exuded natural authority. Everything was in perfect order, exactly as he liked it. The discreet chime of the door's bell made him turn his head, expecting to see some high society client or perhaps Mr. Sterling himself returning from his coffee break. Instead, his eyes met a sight that left him utterly bewildered. A small girl, no more than 6 years old, timidly entered the store. Her clothes were worn and patched. Her disheveled brown hair framed a thin face marked by a determination that strangely contrasted with her fragile appearance. Edward frowned, wondering how a child in such a state had managed to bypass the security of the upscale grandeur mall. His eyes followed her every movement as she walked through the shop, her bare feet making soft sounds against the polished marble. There was something in her eyes, a desperate urgency he couldn't quite comprehend. The child walked directly to the nearest suit, a classic English wool model that cost over $5,000. Edward watched, fascinated yet concerned, as she struggled to pull the garment from the hanger, her small hands barely able to reach properly. The contrast was almost surreal, that ragged child handling one of the store's most expensive pieces with the seriousness of an experienced shopper. When she finally managed to hold the suit, Edward noticed how the fabric dragged on the floor, too large for her to carry properly. Even so, the girl persisted, walking toward the counter with a determination that impressed him. It was then that she did something that utterly astonished him. She pulled a crumpled $5 bill from her pocket, carefully smoothed it with her small hands, and held it up towards him. "Mister, I want to buy a suit," she said in a clear, determined voice. Her large eyes fixed on his face with devastating sincerity. Edward felt something stir in his chest, a strange emotion he hadn't experienced in years. His first reaction was amusement. The situation was so absurd it almost seemed like an elaborate prank. He chuckled, a low, controlled sound that echoed through the empty store. "Sweetheart," he said, crouching down to her level. "The $5 wouldn't even buy a tie in this store." His voice maintained the condescending tone he naturally used with people of lower social standing. But there was something in the girl's eyes that made him feel uncomfortable with his own attitude. Curiosity, however, was stronger than his embarrassment. There was something deeply intriguing about the situation. A child clearly experiencing homelessness, entering one of the city's most exclusive stores with the absolute conviction that $5 would be enough to buy a luxury suit. "What do you need a suit for?" he asked, genuinely curious about what kind of answer a child would give to that question. The answer that followed would change his life forever, challenging everything he thought he knew about value, dignity, and the true meaning of wealth. The girl looked at Edward with those large, serious eyes, as if she were about to reveal the most important secret in the world. She took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts with the precision of someone who had rehearsed those words many times in her small mind. "No, mister, I don't have a dad," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I need a suit because I need money. My grandma is very sick in the hospital, and there's no one to take care of me. I need to take care of her too. But her surgery is very expensive." Edward felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. The brutal simplicity of those words cut through all his emotional defenses like a sharp blade. He had expected a childish answer, perhaps something about a costume party or a game of make-believe. He never imagined that behind those determined eyes existed such profound pain and such a heavy responsibility for someone so small. "I saw that at the hospital. Only people who wear suits get surgery because they have money," the girl continued, her childish logic revealing a devastatingly accurate perception of the world's inequalities. "So I came to buy my suit too, because I want to have money." Tears began to well up in Edward's eyes, something that hadn't happened in decades. His throat tightened as he processed the magnitude of what he had just heard. A 6-year-old child had observed the healthcare system, identified that only well-dressed and presumably wealthy people received adequate treatment for their loved ones, and concluded that a suit was the key to solving her problems. The devastating innocence of that conclusion revealed not only the purity of her heart, but also the fundamental flaw of a society that allowed a child to reach such a bitter understanding of how the world worked. Edward realized he was trembling slightly, his perfectly manicured hands clenching into involuntary fists. What's your name?" he asked, his voice coming out hoarser than he intended. "Sophia," she replied, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "And my grandma's name is Eleanor. She raised me after Mum went to heaven. Now it's just us two, but she's very weak, and the doctors say some difficult words that I don't really understand." Edward fully crouched down, meeting Sophia's eye level. Up close, he could better see the signs of deprivation on her small face. Slightly sunken cheeks suggesting malnutrition, dark circles indicating sleepless nights, small, calloused hands like someone who already knew hard work, despite her tender age. "Sophia," he said softly, "where are you living now that your grandma is in the hospital?" The girl lowered her eyes, as if the question brought a shame she didn't know how to express. "And I sleep on the street near the hospital. They don't let kids stay inside at night if there's no responsible adult, but I stay real close to her window so she knows I haven't left." The image of that child sleeping on the cold street, alone and vulnerable, just to be near the only person she loved in the world, made Edward feel a physical ache in his chest. His businessman's mind immediately began to calculate solutions. But a deeper part of himself was being transformed by that unexpected encounter. "And what kind of surgery does your grandma need?" he asked, his voice now completely filled with compassion. "The doctors said it's for her heart, that it costs a lot of money, and that without it—" Sophia couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Edward perfectly understood what was implied in those unspoken words. In that moment, looking at that courageous child who had entered his life like a hurricane of innocence and determination, Edward Montgomery felt something break inside him, and at the same time, something new begin to be born. He didn't know it yet, but his orderly, predictable life was about to be completely revolutionized by a lesson about love, sacrifice, and the true meaning of wealth. Edward remained crouched before Sophia for a few moments that felt eternal. his mind processing not just her words, but also the transformation he felt happening within himself. 30 years of building a life based on control, planning, and emotional detachment were being challenged by a 6-year-old child who didn't even know his full name. "Sophia," he finally said, his voice taking on a tone of decision she recognized immediately. "I'm going to help you." The girl's eyes lit up with a hope so pure and intense that Edward felt his heart clench even tighter. She held the $5 bill tighter, as if it were a talisman capable of performing miracles. "So you'll sell me the suit then?" she asked, excitement making her voice sound higher-pitched. Edward smiled for the first time in weeks. Not the calculated smile he used in business meetings or social events, but a genuine smile that came from a long-forgotten place in his soul. "No, sweetheart, you'll keep your $5. I'm going to take care of your grandma's surgery." Sophia tilted her head to the side, confused. "But you don't wear a suit, so how will you have money?" The innocent question made Edward realize how distorted the worldview that child had developed was. He was wearing a suit that cost more than many people earned in months. But to Sophia, only suits were symbols of wealth, not the people who wore them. "I already have money, Sophia, and I'm going to use some of it to help you and your grandma," he explained, pulling his phone from his pocket. "What's the name of the hospital she's at?" "St. Jude's Medical Center," Sophia replied quickly. "She's in room 238. Nurse Carla is very nice to me. She always lets me see Grandma through the window when the doctors aren't looking." Edward dialed the hospital's number, his mind already formulating plans. As one of the institution's primary donors, he knew a single call from him would open doors that remained closed to people like Sophia and Eleanor. While he waited for the call to be answered, he observed the girl who now looked at him with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "This is Edward Montgomery," he said when someone finally answered. "I need to speak with Dr. Harrison about a patient named Eleanor. What's your grandma's last name, Sophia?" "Rodriguez," she replied promptly. "Eleanor Rodriguez." "Eleanor Rodriguez," Edward repeated into the phone. "I want to authorize all necessary procedures for her treatment, including the heart surgery. Please put everything on my account." Sophia listened to the conversation with eyes growing wider and wider. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she perceived that something important was being decided. When Edward hung up the phone, she clutched the hem of his pants with both small hands. "Mr. Edward," she said, having heard his name during the call, "does that mean Grandma will get better?" "Yes, sweetheart." "Your grandma will have the best surgery possible," Edward replied, feeling a satisfaction unlike any business deal he had ever closed. "But now we need to sort out something else important. You can't keep sleeping on the street." "But I need to stay close to Grandma," Sophia protested, panic starting to creep into her voice. "If I'm not there, she'll think I abandoned her like everyone else does." Edward felt another emotional stab. How many people had abandoned that child for her to develop such a deep fear? "No one is going to abandon either of you," he said firmly. "I'll arrange a place for you to stay near the hospital until your grandma recovers." Sophia let go of the $5 bill, which fluttered to the floor like a dry leaf. She ran to Edward and hugged him tightly, her thin arms barely able to wrap around his waist. "Thank you." "Mr. Edward," she mumbled against the expensive fabric of his suit. "I knew people in suits were special." Edward hugged her back, surprising himself with the intensity of the emotion he felt. In that moment, in the silent tailor shop, he didn't know he was about to face the fiercest resistance of his life, resistance that would come from within his own home. The Montgomery estate rose majestically on the city's most exclusive hill, its perfectly manicured gardens reflecting the same obsession with control that Edward applied to all aspects of his life. As he entered the main door, he could still feel Sophia's embrace echoing in his memory, a strange and comforting sensation he hadn't experienced in years. He had left the girl at the hospital under Nurse Carla's care after ensuring she would have a safe place to sleep in the family lounge area. The sound of Vivian's high heels, echoing through the marble hall, announced her presence even before she appeared. His wife descended the curved staircase with the studied elegance of someone who had spent decades perfecting every movement to make an impact. At 45, Vivian maintained an artificial but impressive beauty, the result of countless cosmetic procedures and a rigorous regimen of exercise and diets. Her blonde hair was kept in an impeccable cut, and she never appeared in public or even at home without being perfectly made up and dressed as if for a social event. "Edward, darling," she said, her voice carrying that sugary tone she used when she wanted something, "I received a very interesting call from St. Jude's Medical Center a few hours ago. Apparently, you authorized a rather expensive medical procedure for someone named Eleanor Rodriguez." Edward felt a knot in his stomach. He had completely forgotten that Vivian received reports of all significant financial movements from their joint accounts. As his wife and partner in several of his ventures, she had access to information about all expenses exceeding certain amounts. "Yes," he replied, trying to keep his voice casual as he loosened his tie. "It's a situation that required immediate attention." "A situation," Vivian repeated, her voice taking on a frosty tone Edward knew well. "Edward. In this new situation will cost over $50,000 for someone who, from what I've gathered, is indigent with no connection to our social or business circles." Edward watched his wife, noting how she could discuss the value of a human life with the same coldness with which she debated the purchase of a new jewelry set. "It's a humanitarian matter, Vivian. An elderly woman who needs urgent heart surgery." Humanitarian? The word left Vivian's mouth as if it were distasteful to her palate. "Edward, we already do our part with donations for the charity galas. That's humanitarian, and it also provides us with the right social connections. What you did is just a miscalculated impulse." "Miscalculated?" Edward felt irritation rising in his chest. "We're talking about saving a life. Vivian, we're talking about setting dangerous precedents," she retorted, walking to the bar and pouring herself a glass of white wine. "If we start funding medical treatments for anyone who shows up with a sad story, where will it end? Our reputation is based on carefully selected associations, not impulsive acts of charity." Edward watched his wife drink the wine with the calculated elegance that characterized all her gestures. For 22 years of marriage, he had admired that sophistication, that ability to always remain in control. Now, for the first time, those very qualities seemed cold and empty to him. "There's a child involved," he said calmly. "A 6-year-old girl who was sleeping on the street because she had nowhere to go while her grandmother was hospitalized." "Ah," Vivian said, as if a puzzle piece had clicked into place. "Now I understand. You had one of your sentimental moments. Edward, darling, you need to be more careful with these tendencies. Remember what happened last time? You got too emotionally involved with a cause." Edward remembered. 3 years prior, he had tried to help an employee's family facing hardship, and Vivian had orchestrated a subtle but effective campaign to make him give up, arguing he was being manipulated and that his generosity was being misinterpreted by the staff. "This is different," he said, but his voice sounded less convincing than he would have liked. "It's exactly the same thing," Vivian said, approaching him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You have too big a heart, Edward. It's one of your most endearing qualities, but also one of your most dangerous weaknesses. Let me handle this situation. I'll cancel the authorization and we'll transfer the patient to the county hospital system. They have adequate resources for cases like this." "No," Edward said, surprised by the firmness of his own voice. The silence that followed was charged with tension. Vivian was unaccustomed to being contradicted, especially on matters she considered within her purview. Edward's "no" echoed through the room like a gunshot in a silent library. Vivian froze with the wine glass halfway to her lips, her eyes narrowing as she processed something she rarely experienced: direct resistance from her husband. For over 2 decades of marriage, she had carefully cultivated a dynamic where her opinions and desires always prevailed, especially on matters she considered fundamental to maintaining her social standing. "Pardon?" she said, placing the glass on the marble table with a delicate clink that sounded menacing in the tense silence. "And I don't believe I heard you correctly." "You heard perfectly, Vivian," Edward replied, feeling a strange mix of liberation and terror. "I said no. Eleanor Rodriguez's surgery will proceed as planned, and Sophia will have all the support she needs." "Sophia?" Vivian's voice rose half a tone, as it always did when she felt she was losing control of a situation. "Now the beggar has a name. Edward, you're being completely irrational. This isn't just about money, though $50,000 isn't exactly pocket change. It's about precedent and reputation." Edward walked to the window overlooking the perfectly manicured gardens of his estate. For years, he had found peace in that ordered view, where every shrub, every flower, every stone was exactly where he had planned. Now, the artificial perfection of that landscape seemed sterile and lifeless to him, especially when compared to the raw strength and crude beauty of the courage he had seen in Sophia's eyes. "Reputation," he repeated, turning to face his wife. "Vivian, what kind of reputation do we have if we're capable of ignoring the suffering of a child and her grandmother? The kind of reputation that keeps us in the right circles," she replied coldly. "The kind that secured invitations to all the important events of the last 20 years. The kind that opened doors to lucrative deals and valuable connections. Edward, you built an empire because you knew how to maintain the proper associations. You can't throw all that away because of a sentimental impulse." "Perhaps it's time to question if those associations are truly worth anything," Edward said, surprising himself with his own words. Vivian watched him as if she were seeing a stranger wearing her husband's face. Her eyes scanned his countenance, searching for signs that this was some kind of test or cruel joke. When she realized he was serious, her expression hardened in a way Edward had never seen before. "Very well," she said, her voice taking on a dangerously calm tone. "If you insist on proceeding with this misguided philanthropy, at least do it discreetly. I do not want my name associated with it in any way. And I hope you have considered the implications for our social engagements in the coming months." "What implications?" Edward asked, though a part of him already knew the answer. "The Hope Foundation charity gala next week, for starters," Vivian said, counting on her perfectly manicured fingers. "You know, the one where you're supposed to announce your candidacy for chairman of the board, and next month's art auction, where we'll finally meet the Japanese investors who could revolutionize your real estate ventures." Edward had completely forgotten about these commitments. For weeks, Vivian had meticulously planned every detail of these events, seeing them as crucial opportunities to expand their social influence and business. His candidacy for the Hope Foundation board, in particular, was something she had coveted for years, not out of genuine interest in the cause, but for the prestige the position conferred. "And there's more," Vivian continued, walking through the room with calculated steps. "I received a call from Margaret Caldwell today. Apparently, there are rumors circulating about your eccentric behavior at Sterling & Co. Fine Tailoring, something about you having a lengthy conversation with a street child." Edward felt his stomach clench. Margaret Caldwell was one of the most influential and gossipy women in their social class. If she was spreading stories about his encounter with Sophia, it meant other people were talking too. "People talk, Edward," Vivian said, noting his reaction. "And when they start talking about strange behavior, especially involving certain vulnerable populations, the interpretations can be very damaging. Do you really want to risk everything we've built for the sake of a child you met a few hours ago?" The question hung in the air like a veiled threat. Edward perfectly understood what his wife was implying, that his help to Sophia could be misinterpreted, that malicious rumors could destroy not only his reputation, but his entire carefully constructed life. For the first time since leaving the tailor shop, Edward felt a pang of uncertainty. Was he truly capable of risking everything for a child he had just met? That night, Edward remained awake until the early hours of dawn, lying beside Vivian, who slept placidly, as if the afternoon's discussion had caused no disturbance to her conscience. The bedroom ceiling, painted with delicate frescoes that had cost a fortune, seemed to press down on him, each shadow cast by the moonlight reminding him of the impossible choices he faced. At 5 in the morning, he gave up trying to sleep and went to his study, where he poured himself a 40-year-old scotch, a bitter irony, considering that bottle cost more than Sophia probably saw in several months. He sat in his Italian leather armchair and looked at the framed photographs decorating his desk. He and Vivian at various social events, always smiling, always impeccable, always representing the perfect image of success. The phone rang at 7 sharp. Interrupting his tortured reflections, it was Dr. Harrison from St. Jude's Medical Center. "Mr. Montgomery," the doctor said, his voice carrying a professional gravity, "I'm calling to inform you about Eleanor Rodriguez. We managed to stabilize her overnight, but her condition is more delicate than we initially imagined. The surgery needs to happen today, or what?" Edward asked, though he already knew the answer. "Or she won't make it past tonight," the doctor finished. "There's an additional complication. Her granddaughter, Sophia, is refusing to eat properly. She insists on staying in the hospital corridor and will only accept water. Our social worker is concerned. A child in such extreme stress can develop serious complications." Edward closed his eyes, feeling the weight of that responsibility multiply. It wasn't just Eleanor who needed help. Sophia was also deteriorating physically and emotionally at the prospect of losing the only person she had left in the world. "I'll be right there," he said, making the decision instantly. "Mr. Montgomery," the doctor hesitated, "there's something else I need to mention. We received a call this morning from someone identifying as a family representative, questioning the authorization for the procedure. Apparently, there are doubts about whether you have the legitimacy to make these medical decisions on behalf of Eleanor Rodriguez." Edward felt his blood run cold. Vivian. She had made good on her threat and was trying to sabotage the surgery through legal channels. "Dr. Harrison, I take full financial and legal responsibility for the treatment. Proceed with the surgery as planned." "I understand, sir, but I suggest you resolve this matter as quickly as possible. Situations like this can become complicated if not properly clarified." After hanging up, Edward remained motionless for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what he was facing. His wife wasn't just opposing his decision, she was actively working to prevent him from helping Sophia and Eleanor. The woman with whom he had shared over 2 decades of his life was willing to let an elderly woman die to protect her social standing. The sound of footsteps in the hallway announced Vivian's arrival. She appeared at the study door, already dressed for her morning exercise regimen, wearing a designer athletic outfit that cost more than many people earned in a month. "Up early today," she commented casually, as if there were no tension between them. "I hope you used that time to reflect on our conversation yesterday." "I did," Edward replied, turning his armchair to face her. "And I've made a decision." "Good," Vivian said, her smile suggesting she was sure he had changed his mind. "I already called the hospital this morning to clarify some legal issues regarding that inappropriate authorization you gave." "I know," Edward said calmly, "and that's exactly why I'm going to the hospital personally now to ensure the surgery happens." Vivian's smile vanished instantly. "Edward, you cannot be serious. After everything we discussed yesterday, after I clearly explained the implications—" "You explained your priorities," he interrupted, rising from the armchair, "and I am explaining mine. Eleanor Rodriguez will have her surgery. Sophia will have all the necessary support, and if our social standing cannot survive an act of basic compassion, then perhaps that standing isn't worth as much as we thought." Vivian watched him as if she were seeing a stranger. Her eyes scanned his face, searching for signs of the controlled, predictable man she had molded over the years. What she found was something that deeply alarmed her: unwavering determination. "You are making the biggest mistake of your life," she said, her voice low and threatening. "And when the consequences start to appear, and they will appear, Edward, remember that I tried to protect you from yourself." Edward nodded slowly. "Perhaps you're right. But I'd rather make the mistake of helping someone than the mistake of abandoning someone who needs me." As he left the house and headed to the hospital, Edward didn't know that Vivian was already dialing numbers, activating a network of social contacts she had meticulously cultivated over the years. The war for Edward Montgomery's soul was just beginning. Edward arrived at St. Jude's Medical Center with a heavy heart, but determined. The imposing glass and concrete building had always seemed to him a symbol of hope and healing. Now he knew that within its walls, a battle was being fought that would define not only Eleanor and Sophia's fate, but also who he truly was as a human being. He found Sophia exactly where Dr. Harrison had described, sitting on the corridor floor, leaning against the wall near the surgical center, her small eyes fixed on the door through which her grandmother had been taken. She hadn't eaten since the previous day, and her already fragile appearance now bordered on transparency. When she saw Edward approaching, her eyes lit up with desperate hope. "Mr. Edward," she exclaimed, trying to stand up quickly but swaying due to weakness. "Grandma, they took her to a place I can't see. They said they're going to fix her heart, but I'm scared she won't come back." Edward knelt beside her, noticing how her small hands trembled with anxiety and hunger. "Sophia, your grandma is in the best hands possible. Dr. Harrison is one of the best doctors in the city. But you need to take care of yourself too. You can't go without eating." "I can't," she whispered, tears starting to stream down her dirty cheeks. "My stomach hurts, but when I think of Grandma alone in there, I promised her I'd never leave her alone again." In that moment, Edward understood the depth of the love between those two people whom life had united against all odds. Sophia wasn't just a scared child, she was a little warrior who had taken on responsibilities that would break many adults. "Do you know what your grandma wants most?" Edward asked softly. "For you to be strong and healthy when she comes out of surgery. Let's make a deal. I'll stay here with you throughout the operation. And you eat something to have the strength to take care of Grandma when she wakes up." Sophia considered the proposal for a few moments, her large eyes pondering the logic of those words. Finally, she nodded. "But do you promise you won't leave, even if it takes a long time?" "I promise," Edward said, extending his pinky finger to seal the deal the way he knew children did. "We'll face this together." It was during those 4 agonizing hours of waiting that something fundamental changed in Edward. Sitting on the cold hospital floor, sharing simple sandwiches from the cafeteria with Sophia, he experienced a deeper human connection than any multi-million-dollar deal or social event had ever provided him. The girl talked about her mother, who had died when she was 3 now. About how Grandma Eleanor had taught her to read using old newspapers found in the trash. About simple dreams that revealed an early wisdom about what truly mattered in life. "Mr. Edward," Sophia said during a pause in her stories, "why are you helping us? Everyone always says people like us don't matter to people like you." The question hit Edward like a lightning bolt. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. Then, looking into those innocent eyes that had seen more suffering than many adults, he found a truth he didn't even know existed within him. "Because you reminded me of what I had forgotten," he said honestly. "That being truly rich isn't about having money. It's about having people to love and who love us back. It's about making a difference in someone's life. You and your grandma gave me something I didn't know I was missing." Sophia smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen on her since they met. In that instant, as he held the girl's small, calloused hand, Edward made a decision that would change everything. No matter what Vivian did, what threats she uttered, or what social consequences he faced, he would not abandon Sophia and Eleanor. When Dr. Harrison finally emerged from the surgical center with a tired but relieved smile, Edward felt he wasn't just hearing news about Eleanor. He was hearing about the future of his own soul. The surgery was a complete success, the doctor announced. Eleanor will need a few weeks of recovery, but she'll have a long and healthy life ahead of her. Sophia cried out with joy and threw herself into Edward's arms, who hugged her with an intensity that surprised them both. In that moment of triumph, he didn't know that Vivian was, at that very instant, implementing a plan that would test his determination beyond any limit he could imagine. 2 days after Eleanor's surgery, Edward awoke to discover his world had been turned upside down overnight. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came when his cell phone rang at 6 in the morning, a call from Marcus Hayes, his personal attorney for over 15 years. "Edward, I need to see you urgently," Marcus said, his voice laden with a tension Edward had rarely heard. "There are legal developments that require immediate attention. I cannot discuss this over the phone." An hour later, Edward was sitting in Marcus's law office, observing stacks of documents scattered across the mahogany desk. The attorney, usually calm and composed, seemed to have aged 10 years since their last conversation. "Edward," Marcus began, removing his glasses to nervously wipe the lenses, "Vivian has filed a petition in court alleging that you are, how can I put this delicately, demonstrating erratic and potentially dangerous behavior." "Dangerous?" Edward felt his blood run cold. "What exactly is she accusing me of?" "She alleges that you've developed an inappropriate fixation on an underage homeless child, that you've been irrationally spending significant sums of money for her benefit, and that this represents both a financial risk to the marital estate and a possible threat to the child's safety," Marcus explained, his voice growing graver with each word. Edward remained silent for several seconds, processing the magnitude of his wife's betrayal. She wasn't just trying to sabotage him, she was trying to destroy him completely, using his compassion for Sophia as a weapon against him. "There's more," Marcus continued reluctantly. "She's secured witnesses who confirm your strange behavior at Sterling & Co. Fine tailoring. Margaret Caldwell and 2 other women from your social circle have given detailed depositions about how you supposedly acted suspiciously while interacting with the child." "Suspicious?" Edward's voice came out louder than he intended. "I helped a desperate child and her dying grandmother. Where exactly is that suspicious?" "Edward, you need to understand," Marcus said. leaning across the table. In the current legal context, especially involving a vulnerable child, any behavior that can be interpreted as inappropriate is taken very seriously. Vivian is building a case that suggests you pose a risk. And what are the practical implications of this? Edward asked, though he feared the answer. There's a temporary court order prohibiting you from having any contact with Sofia Rodriguez until a full investigation is conducted, Marcus replied. Furthermore, your marital assets have been frozen pending the resolution of this matter. Edward felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. Does this mean Sofia can't see me? That I can't visit her in the hospital while Eleanor recovers? It means exactly that. And there's one more complication. Marcus hesitated before continuing. Child Protective Services has been notified about Sofia's situation. They're questioning whether a child without proper guardianship documentation should remain in an expensive private hospital, especially when there are suspicions about the motivations of the person funding her stay. The reality of the situation hit Edward like an avalanche. Vivian had orchestrated a multi-front attack, using the legal system, social services, and social pressure to completely isolate him from Sofia and Eleanor. More than that, she had twisted his compassion in such a way that it now seemed sordid and dangerous. Marcus, Edward said, his voice taking on a fierce determination, I want you to understand something very clearly. I will not abandon Sofia and Eleanor, no matter what Vivian does, what lies she tells, or what systems she corrupts. These two people mean more to me than all the wealth I've accumulated in my life. Edward, you need to be careful with what you say and do going forward, Marcus warned. Any action that could be interpreted as a violation of the court order or as evidence of Vivian's allegations can make your situation much worse. Worse. Edward laughed bitterly. Marcus, they're trying to stop me from helping an orphaned child and her sick grandmother. How could it get worse than this? It could result in criminal charges, Marcus replied coldly. And if that happens, you wouldn't just lose the ability to help Sofia, you'd lose your freedom too. Edward looked out the office window, observing the city's movement below. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, most of them likely never facing the kind of moral battle he was fighting. For a moment, he questioned if Marcus was right, if he should retreat and protect himself. Then he thought of Sofia, probably waking up at that moment in the hospital, looking for him and not understanding why he had suddenly disappeared from her life. He thought of Eleanor, recovering from life-saving surgery, unaware that the person who had helped her was being punished for his compassion. Marcus, he said, rising from his chair, I want you to prepare a counter-petition. We're going to fight this with everything we've got. Edward, Marcus said softly, are you sure you want to risk everything for this? Edward looked at his longtime attorney and friend, seeing the genuine concern in his eyes. Marcus, if I don't risk everything for this, what kind of man am I really? As he left the office, Edward didn't know that his words would reach Vivian's ears before the end of the day, nor that she was already planning her next move in a war that had become far dirtier than he had ever imagined possible. 3 days had passed since Edward had been prohibited from seeing Sofia, and each hour felt like an eternity. He had tried to call the hospital countless times, but the instructions were clear. No information about Eleanor Rodriguez or Sofia could be provided to him due to the court order. Frustration and helplessness consumed him in a way he had never experienced, not even during the worst financial crises of his career. On the morning of the 4th day, Edward was in his home office when the phone rang. It was Carla, the nurse who had cared for Sofia since day one at the hospital. Her voice sounded tense and concerned. "Mr. Montgomery," she whispered, clearly trying not to be overheard. "I shouldn't be calling you, sir," But I can't stay silent about what's happening to Sophia. How is she? Edward asked immediately, his heart racing. She's not doing well, sir. Ever since you stopped coming, she barely talks, barely eats. She sits by her grandma's bed all day, asking when you're coming back. The social worker tried to explain you can't visit her anymore, but she doesn't understand. She thinks she did something wrong, that you got tired of her. Edward closed his eyes, feeling a physical ache in his chest. The thought of Sophia blaming herself for his absence was unbearable. And Eleanor, how is her recovery? Physically, she's recovering well from the surgery, Carla replied. But she's very worried about Sophia. She sees the girl suffering and can't comfort her because she herself doesn't understand what happened. Mr. Montgomery, forgive me for saying this, but what kind of person stops a man from visiting a child he clearly loves as family? Someone who doesn't know the meaning of the word compassion, Edward replied bitterly. Carla, is there anything I can do? Any way for Sophia to know I haven't abandoned her? I can't facilitate any direct contact, sir. It would be against the orders we've received. But, she hesitated, if by chance some flowers or a small gift arrived for Eleanor Rodriguez without sender identification, I couldn't stop the grandmother from sharing them with her granddaughter, could I? Edward understood immediately. Thank you, Carla. You're an angel. No, Mr. Montgomery, you are the angel. There are many wealthy people in this city, but I've never seen any who genuinely cared about children like Sophia. Please, don't give up on her. After hanging up, Edward immediately contacted a florist, asking them to send a bouquet of daisies, Sophia's favorite flowers, as he had discovered during their conversations at the hospital, along with a small teddy bear wearing a miniature suit. The card was to simply read, "To Sophia, from someone who will never forget you, keep being brave." Later that day, Edward had a meeting with Marcus about the legal developments of the case. The news wasn't encouraging. The Child Protective Services investigation is being fast-tracked, Marcus informed, flipping through documents. And there's an additional complication. Vivian has managed to have Sophia designated for transfer to a state foster care facility, claiming that the hospital environment is not suitable for a child without family. But Eleanor is her family, Edward protested. Eleanor is recovering from major heart surgery and, according to official records, lacks legal documentation establishing her guardianship over Sophia, Marcus explained. Furthermore, she has no financial resources to support a child. From a bureaucratic standpoint, Sophia is considered an orphan without an adequate guardian. Edward felt despair growing. The system that was supposed to protect Sophia was being used against her, turning her into a victim of cold, dehumanizing regulations. When would this transfer happen? He asked. Under tomorrow, Marcus replied solemnly, unless a suitable legal guardian appears or the court order is revoked. And what are the chances of getting the court order revoked? Marcus sighed deeply. Frankly, very small. Vivian has witnesses, detailed documentation of expenses she characterizes as excessive and irrational, and a very skillful attorney who is painting you as someone with dangerous fixations. Edward walked to the window, observing the gardens that once brought him peace. Now, all that artificial perfection seemed to mock him, reminding him how he had lived a life isolated from the world's true problems until he met Sophia. Marcus, he said finally, I want you to prepare the papers for me to adopt Sophia. Edward, Marcus exclaimed, clearly alarmed. That would be seen as an extreme escalation of your obsessive behavior. Vivian would use it as definitive evidence that you've lost your mind. Then let her, Edward replied, turning to face his attorney. Marcus, this child has no one in the world besides an elderly grandmother who can barely take care of herself. If I don't fight for her, who will? If I don't risk everything to protect her, what kind of man am I? A man who could end up losing not just Sophia, but his freedom and all means to help her in the future, Marcus replied gravely. Edward looked at the portrait on the wall, a photo of him with Vivian at a charity ball, both smiling and elegant, representing everything he had once considered important. Now, that image seemed to him the representation of an empty and purposeless life. "Marcus," he said with a determination that surprised them both, "I'd rather risk everything fighting for something that truly matters than live the rest of my life knowing I abandoned a child when she needed me most." That night, as he prepared the documents that could seal his fate, Edward didn't know that Sophia had found the teddy bear and was sleeping clutching it for the first time in days, whispering, "Mr. Edward didn't forget me. He's coming back." The dawn of the 5th day brought with it a sense of desperate urgency. Edward knew he had only a few hours before Sophia would be transferred to the state foster care facility, a place that, according to his research the previous night, was overcrowded and offered little more than basic survival. The idea of that special child getting lost in an impersonal bureaucratic system was intolerable. At 7 in the morning, Marcus called with news that would completely change the course of events. "Edward, you need to see today's newspaper headlines," the attorney said, his voice carrying a mix of shock and admiration. "Someone leaked the story to the press, and not in the way Vivian expected." 15 minutes later, Edward was in Marcus's office, observing the front pages of the city's major newspapers scattered across the table. The headlines left him stunned. "Millionaire battles own wife to save orphaned child. High society's legal clash. Compassion or obsession." Sophia, 6, the girl who changed a real estate mogul's life. "Marcus, how did this happen?" Edward asked, picking up one of the newspapers to read the full article. "Apparently, someone close to the situation decided the public should know the truth," Marcus replied. The articles tell the whole story, from the encounter at the tailor shop to Eleanor's surgery, through the court order and Sophia's impending transfer to state foster care." Edward quickly read one of the articles, impressed by the precision of the details. Whoever provided the information was intimately familiar with all aspects of the situation. The article painted a devastating portrait of Vivian as a cold and calculating woman, willing to destroy an innocent child to protect her social standing. "And there's more," Marcus continued, pointing to his constantly ringing phone. "The story has gone viral on social media. Justice for Sophia is trending nationwide. Hundreds of people are offering help, donations, and demanding the court order be revoked." Edward's phone also began ringing incessantly. Journalists, attorneys offering pro bono services, child advocacy organizations, and ordinary people who had been moved by the story. In just a few hours, what Vivian had tried to use to destroy him had become a national cause. By noon, a crowd had gathered in front of the courthouse where Sophia's fate would be decided. Edward watched from Marcus's office window, seeing signs with phrases like, "Protect Sophia," "Edward is a hero," and "Down with injustice." "Edward," Marcus said, hanging up yet another call. "I just got off the phone with the judge overseeing the case. He wants an emergency hearing today to re-evaluate the situation. The public pressure is immense." "And is that good or bad for us?" Edward asked. "It depends," Marcus replied thoughtfully. "On one hand, public opinion is clearly on our side. On the other, judges don't like to feel pressured. We need to be very careful about how we present our case." At 3 in the afternoon, Edward found himself in court, facing a hearing that would determine not only Sophia's future, but also his own redemption or ruin. The room was packed with journalists, human rights activists, and curious onlookers who had followed the story. Vivian was sitting on the other side of the room with her attorney, her expression showing signs of nervousness for the first time. She clearly hadn't anticipated that her strategy would backfire so spectacularly. When the judge entered, the silence in the room was absolute. The magistrate, a 60-year-old man with a reputation for rigor and fairness, looked around the packed courtroom before speaking. "This case has taken on proportions far exceeding a common domestic dispute," he began. "We are here to determine what is best for a 6-year-old child, not to satisfy public curiosity or resolve marital issues." Vivian's attorney was the first to speak, reiterating allegations of Edward's inappropriate and obsessive behavior, but his presentation sounded weak and artificial in the face of the facts that had been exposed by the press. When it was Marcus's turn, he stood with a dignity Edward had never seen before. "Your Honor," Marcus began, "this case boils down to a very simple question. Is it wrong for a man to use his wealth to save the life of a child and her grandmother? Is it obsession or compassion to want to protect a minor who has no one else in the world?" Marcus then did something unexpected. He called Eleanor Rodriguez as a witness. Edward turned in surprise to see Eleanor entering the courtroom in a wheelchair, still recovering from surgery, but determined to speak. Her face, though pale, radiated a dignity that silenced the entire room. "Your Honor," Eleanor said in a weak but firm voice, "Edward Montgomery saved my life and my granddaughter's. If that is obsession, then God grant us more such obsessive men in this world." It was then that Edward knew the truth had finally found its voice, and that the battle for Sophia's soul and for his own was about to reach its decisive climax. Eleanor's testimony echoed through the courtroom like a silent prayer, her words carrying the weight of a gratitude that transcended any legal argument. Edward watched the judge's face, trying to decipher his expressions as the magistrate absorbed every word from the elderly woman who had risked her fragile health to be there. "Ms. Rodriguez," the judge said gently, "do you understand the gravity of the allegations made against Mr. Montgomery? Some people suggest his motivations may not be appropriate." Eleanor looked directly at the judge, her eyes still shining with the determination she had passed on to her granddaughter. "Your Honor, I raised Sophia since she was 3. I learned to recognize when someone looks at her with true love and when someone has other intentions. Edward Montgomery looked at my granddaughter as a grandfather would look at his own family. He saw a child in need and didn't hesitate to help, even knowing it would cost him dearly." "And how would you characterize his behavior during his hospital visits?" Vivian's attorney asked, attempting one last move. "As the behavior of a man who finally discovered what truly matters in life," Eleanor replied without hesitation. "He played with Sophia, told her stories, held her hand when she was scared. He did everything a loving father would do." It was then that something unexpected happened. The courtroom door opened and Sophia entered, accompanied by Carla, the nurse. The girl was wearing a simple but clean dress, her hair finally neatly combed, but her large eyes immediately sought Edward in the crowd. "Mr. Edward!" she cried, running toward him before anyone could stop her. Edward instinctively stood up, opening his arms to receive her. Sophia threw herself into his embrace with a force that almost knocked him over, and he held her as if his life depended on it. For a moment, the entire courtroom disappeared. There were only him and that courageous child who had transformed his existence. "I knew you hadn't forgotten me," Sophia whispered against his shoulder. "The teddy bear told me you'd come back." The judge observed the scene in silence for a few moments, and Edward could see something transform in the magistrate's expression. There was no way to feign or fabricate the genuine connection he was witnessing between the man and the child. "Your Honor," Marcus said, seizing the moment, "I request permission for Sofia Rodriguez to speak for herself. At 6 years old, she has already demonstrated enough maturity to understand her own situation." Vivian's attorney immediately protested, but the judge raised his hand to silence him. "The child may speak." Sofia looked around the packed room, then turned to the judge with the same determination she had shown at the tailor shop weeks before. "Mr. Judge," she said in her clear, determined voice, "everyone is talking about Mr. Edward, but no one asked what I want." "And what do you want, Sofia?" the judge asked gently. "I want to stay with my grandma and Mr. Edward," she replied simply. "They're my family now. Mr. Edward taught me that good people exist in the world, that not everyone will abandon me. He promised he would take care of me and Grandma, and he always keeps his promises. And what if I told you that you could have a new family with people who have more money and a big house?" the judge asked, testing her conviction. Sofia frowned as if the question made no sense. "But Mr. Edward already has money and a big house, and he chose me, even though I had nothing to give him. Isn't that what makes a real family?" Sofia's innocent question struck a chord with everyone in the room. Edward felt tears streaming down his face, no longer caring about appearances or what anyone thought of him. The judge leaned back in his chair, clearly reflecting on everything he had heard. After a few moments that seemed eternal, he addressed Edward directly. "Mr. Montgomery," he said, "this situation is highly irregular. Men in your social position rarely become so deeply involved with children in socially vulnerable situations. This raises legitimate questions about motivations and suitability." Edward felt his heart stop for a moment. "However," the judge continued, "after observing the interactions here today, reading the medical reports on the exemplary care Ms. Rodriguez received thanks to your funding, and considering the passionate but compelling testimony of this remarkable child, I conclude that your actions demonstrate not obsession but genuine compassion." The relief Edward felt was so intense that his legs almost gave out. "Therefore," the judge declared solemnly, "I hereby revoke the restraining order against Mr. Montgomery and authorize him to proceed with the adoption procedures for Sofia Rodriguez, provided that Eleanor Rodriguez formally consents and that all standard social background checks are satisfactorily completed." The room erupted in applause. But Edward only had eyes for Sofia, who looked at him with a radiant smile that was worth more than any fortune he had ever accumulated. 2 weeks after the court decision, Edward was facing the full consequences of his choice. The victory in court had been merely the first step of a journey that would require sacrifices he was only beginning to comprehend. Vivian, publicly humiliated and exposed as the true villain of the story, had become a person he barely recognized. Or perhaps he was finally seeing who she truly always had been. "You destroyed everything," she said coldly, walking through the living room of the mansion that would soon no longer be hers. 22 years of marriage. Our social standing, our business connections, all thrown away because of a child you met by chance. Edward watched his wife pack her most valuable jewelry, each movement calculated to create maximum dramatic impact. Even in her fury, Vivian maintained the studied elegance that characterized her, as if she were incapable of being authentic even in her most vulnerable moments. "I didn't destroy anything of real value," Edward replied calmly. "I merely discovered that our life was a very expensive illusion." "An illusion." Vivian's voice rose an octave. "Edward, you were respected, admired, envied. You had access to the most exclusive circles, the best deals, opportunities men would kill for, and you threw all that away for what? For a fantasy of being a hero to an orphaned child. For a chance to be a real person, Edward corrected. For 22 years, I lived a life that looked perfect on the outside, but was completely empty inside. Sophia showed me what I had lost when I chose financial success over genuine human connection. Vivian stopped packing and stared at him with an expression that mixed disdain and something that might have been sadness if she were capable of genuine feelings. "And you think you'll be happy?" she asked, "living with a child who isn't your own daughter, supporting a sick, elderly woman, being seen by society as the man who lost his mind? Edward, you can't imagine the isolation you're about to face." "Perhaps," Edward admitted, "but I'd rather face that isolation than live a lifetime pretending that our previous existence had any real meaning." At that moment, the sound of laughter coming from the garden caught both their attention. Edward looked out the window and saw Sophia playing with Eleanor, who was recovering remarkably well since leaving the hospital. The girl was teaching her grandmother how to plant daisies in the flower bed Edward had prepared especially for them, a small revolution in the perfectly manicured landscape that once dominated the gardens. "Look at them," Edward said softly. "When was the last time you felt the pure joy Sophia demonstrates just by planting a flower? When was the last time we experienced true gratitude for something simple like a sunny day?" Vivian followed his gaze, but her expression remained cold. "Cheap sentimentality," she murmured. "You'll find that joy doesn't pay bills when your businesses start to suffer the consequences of your tarnished reputation." It was true that the financial consequences had already begun. Several important clients had cancelled contracts, citing incompatibility of values. The invitation to join the Hope Foundation board had been discreetly withdrawn. Margaret Caldwell and her social circle had taken it upon themselves to spread distorted versions of the story, painting Edward as a man who had lost his mind over an inappropriate fixation. But something surprising had also happened. A new category of people had begun to seek him out: working families who needed decent housing, charity organizations seeking support for genuine causes, professionals who admired his moral courage. He discovered that there was a whole world of decent people he had never known during his life in elite circles. "Vivian," Edward said, turning to face her one last time, "in all these years, did you ever truly love me? Or was I just a convenient piece in your social game?" The question caught Vivian off guard. For a moment, her mask of coldness slipped, revealing something that might have been vulnerability, but it was only for an instant. "Love is a luxury people in our position cannot afford," she finally replied. "Marriages like ours are strategic partnerships. I fulfilled my part of the agreement. You're the one who decided to change the rules in the middle of the game." Edward nodded slowly, finally understanding there was nothing more to be said. They had lived decades together without ever truly knowing each other. "The keys to the penthouse in Manhattan are on the table," he said. "The lawyers will finalize the divorce details. You will have financial security to live comfortably for the rest of your life." "How generous," Vivian said sarcastically. "The man who destroyed my world offers me a few crumbs to ease his guilt." "It's not guilt," Edward corrected. "It's responsibility. For years, I was complicit in a life that had no real meaning. The difference now is that I've found something worth living for." When Vivian finally left the mansion that afternoon, taking with her Edward's last connections to his previous life, he felt not sadness but relief. As painful as it was to acknowledge, his marriage had been an elegant charade, a convenient arrangement disguised as romance. That night, As he helped Sophia with her homework at the kitchen table, something he had never done in his previous life, Edward understood that he had traded a grandiose but empty existence for a simple yet deeply meaningful life. And for the first time in decades, he felt completely at peace with himself. 6 months after the court decision, Edward woke up on a Saturday morning not to the sound of the alarm clock that for decades had marked his business mornings, but to Sophia's laughter echoing down the hallway. She was trying to wake Eleanor for the special breakfast they had planned to make together, animal-shaped pancakes, a tradition that had started by chance and become sacred in their new family routine. The mansion had been transformed in ways that went far beyond decoration. The formal study where Edward conducted business meetings had become a playroom and study area for Sophia. The dining room, once used only for elaborate social events, now hosted simple but joyful dinners every night. The perfectly manicured garden had given way to vegetable beds that Sophia and Eleanor tended with dedication, as well as a small playground Edward had installed. "Dad, Edward!" Sophia shouted, running into his room and jumping onto the bed as she did every morning. The title had emerged naturally. Without formal discussions or solemn moments, it simply happened when she realized he was there to stay, that he wasn't just a temporary Mr. Edward, but a permanent presence in her life. "Good morning, Princess," he replied, hugging her and feeling that sense of completeness that still surprised him every day. "How did you sleep?" "I dreamed we were a real family," Sophia said, then paused and frowned. "But we already are a real family." "Right, the most real I've ever had," Edward confirmed, kissing the top of her head. The adoption process had been finalized 2 weeks prior in a simple ceremony at the courthouse. This time, there were no crowds or journalists, just Edward, Sophia, Eleanor, Marcus, and a few close friends who had proven themselves true during the difficult times. When the judge officially declared Sophia Rodriguez had become Sophia Montgomery, she had asked if that meant she would never again be separated from her new family. The judge's confirmation had brought tears of joy that still moistened Edward's eyes when he remembered the moment Eleanor, now fully recovered from heart surgery, had become more than a grandmother to Sophia. She was the matriarch of their new family, the person whose wisdom and life experience balanced Sophia's youthful energy and Edward's determination. She had officially moved into the mansion, occupying the suite that was once reserved for important guests and transforming it into a cozy home filled with photographs, plants, and the aromas of her homemade cooking. "Edward," Eleanor said that morning, finding him in the kitchen while Sophia was getting ready for the day, "I need to tell you something I've been thinking about for weeks." "Of course, Eleanor." "What is it?" "When Sophia was younger and we were in great need, I used to pray for a miracle," she said, her experienced hands preparing coffee with movements that had become a comforting part of the morning routine. "I asked God to send someone who could help us survive. I never imagined he would send someone who needed us as much as we needed him." Edward felt the familiar tightening in his throat that accompanied the moments of intense emotion that were now a regular part of his life. "Eleanor, I'm the one who needs to thank you. You two saved me from a life I didn't even know was killing me inside." "No, my dear," Eleanor said, using the affectionate term she had adopted for him. "God brought us together because we all needed each other. Sophia needed a father. I needed someone to help me raise her properly, and you needed to learn what truly matters in life." The transformation in Edward had been profound and permanent. His businesses, though smaller due to the loss of some elitist clients, had become more focused on housing development for middle-class families. He discovered that there was much greater satisfaction in building homes for people who truly needed them than in erecting another luxury skyscraper for wealthy investors. His new social circles included parents of other students at Sophia's school, families who had benefited from his housing projects, and professionals who admired his personal transformation. Conversations were about real things: raising children, family challenges, simple but meaningful dreams. It was a world he never knew existed during his years in elite circles. "Dad," Sophia said, appearing in the kitchen dressed in a yellow dress she had chosen herself, "can we go to the park after lunch today? I want to show Grandma how I learned to walk the balance beam." "Of course, Princess," Edward replied, "but first, let's make those special pancakes you promised Grandma." As the three worked together in the kitchen, Sophia mixing the batter, Eleanor guiding the process, and Edward trying not to burn the pancakes as they laughed at his limited culinary skills, he reflected on how his definition of success had completely changed. 6 months prior, success meant closing multi-million-dollar deals, invitations to exclusive events, and the respect of the financial elite. Now, success was a 6-year-old child running home from school, eager to tell him about her day. It was an elderly grandmother smiling as she watched her granddaughter grow up safely. It was waking up every morning knowing that his life had real purpose and that there were people who depended on him not for what he possessed, but for who he was. That afternoon, as he watched Sophia playing in the park under Eleanor's attentive and loving gaze, Edward understood that he had found something no amount of money could buy: a family built not by blood ties or social convenience, but by genuine love, mutual sacrifice, and the conscious decision to care for each other above all else. 1 year after that fateful encounter at Sterling & Co., fine tailoring, Edward walked hand in hand with Sophia down the same street where it all began. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon, and they were on their way to a special mission Sophia had insisted on accomplishing. Eleanor accompanied them, walking slowly but steadily, a serene smile on her face as she watched the affectionate interaction between the man who had become her son and the girl who was her greatest treasure. "Are you sure you want to do this, Princess?" Edward asked, stopping in front of the tailor shop that now had a discreet sign in its window, "Under new management." "I'm sure, Dad," Sophia replied with the determination Edward had learned to recognize and admire. "I want to show Mr. Sterling how the story ended. 3 months prior, when the tailor shop had faced financial difficulties due to the recession hitting the luxury sector, Edward had made a proposal that surprised everyone: to buy the establishment, not to close it or transform it into something completely different, but to maintain it as a tailor shop that catered to all social classes. The back of the store now functioned as a free tailoring school for young people and adults who wanted to learn a dignified profession. The doorbell chimed with the same delicate sound as always when they entered. Mr. Sterling, now the managing partner of the establishment, smiled broadly upon seeing them. The elderly man had become more than an employee. He was a dear friend who often dined with them and had become a kind of adoptive grandfather to Sophia. "And my little Sophia," he exclaimed, opening his arms to receive her. "And how's my favorite little tailor?" Sophia ran to hug him, then immediately headed to the back of the store, where there was a small table with a sewing machine adapted for her small hands. Over the past few months, she had spent several afternoons there, learning the secrets of tailoring under Mr. Sterling's patient tutelage. "Mr. Sterling," Sophia said solemnly, "I finished the special project." From the low cabinet next to her table, she carefully took out a small suit made especially for her. It wasn't perfect. The stitches were still uneven in some places, and one of the sleeves was slightly longer than the other, but it was clearly made with incredible love and dedication. "I want to show you," she said, disappearing into the small, adapted fitting room Edward had installed. A few minutes later, Sophia emerged wearing her hand-stitched suit, The navy blue jacket had details that told her story. Small daisies embroidered on the pocket, her favorite flowers that now grew in their home garden. The initials SM, Sophia Montgomery, were delicately stitched into the lining. And most touching of all, on the inside of the lapel, she had embroidered the words, "Family is love," in small but neatly stitched letters. "It's perfect, Princess," Edward said. His voice choked with emotion. "You've become a true tailor." "No, Dad," Sophia corrected, adjusting the small tie she had chosen, specially to match the suit. "I learned that a suit doesn't make a person rich. People make other people rich." Eleanor wiped a discreet tear, remembering how, a year prior, that same child had entered that store believing that a suit would give her access to the money needed to save her life. "Do you know the difference between this suit and the one I wanted to buy on the first day?" Sophia asked, twirling to show how the outfit fit her small figure perfectly. "What is it, sweetheart?" asked Mr. Sterling, crouching down to her level. "That suit was going to give me money," Sophia said wisely. "This suit gave me a family." Edward looked around the transformed tailor shop. On the walls, where once there had only been photos of famous clients and very expensive suits, there were now also photographs of the tailoring school graduates, young people who had learned a profession and secured dignified jobs. An entire section of the store was dedicated to quality clothing at affordable prices, allowing people from all social classes to dress with dignity. "Sophia," Edward said, kneeling beside her, "do you remember what you told me the first day we met? About wanting a suit to have money." "I remember," she replied, smiling. "I was very silly back then." "You weren't silly," Edward corrected gently. "You were a brave child trying to solve a very big problem alone. But now you've discovered something many adults never learn." "What?" "That the most valuable suit is woven with threads of love, sacrifice, and genuine compassion," Edward said, echoing words she herself had used without knowing. "And that suit you were already wearing from the first day I met you." Sophia considered these words for a moment, then smiled with that precocious wisdom that continued to surprise everyone around her. "So, you mean when I walked in here on the first day, I already had the most expensive suit in the store?" she asked. "You had the most valuable suit in the whole world," Edward confirmed, hugging her tight. That afternoon, as they walked back home, Edward, Sophia, and Eleanor, a family united not by blood, but by choice and love, they passed by the same hospital where everything had complicated and resolved itself. Sophia waved to the window of the room where her grandmother had recovered, and Edward thought about how life can completely change in a matter of weeks when we make the right decisions for the right reasons. Sterling & Co. Fine Tailoring continued operating behind them. Now, not just as a place where expensive clothes were sold to wealthy people, but as a symbol that true elegance isn't in what we wear, but in the character we carry, in the compassion we show, and in the love we offer to those whom society often forgets. Edward had learned that sometimes we need to lose everything we think defines us to discover who we truly are. And Sophia had taught a rich man that the most valuable suit is one that isn't bought with money, but earned through acts of genuine kindness. The girl who once wanted to buy a suit to have money now understood that true value isn't in what we wear, but in the heart we carry. And the millionaire who believed his wealth lay in his possessions discovered it had always resided in his capacity to love and be loved.